Thank you very much, Cooper, for reading that long text. Bet you thought you were going to be up here longer than I am tonight, didn't you? It's great to see all of you here tonight. We want to welcome you. We want you to know how delighted we are that you're here. We're honored to have you. If you're a guest, we're especially glad that you are here. We want to express our appreciation to everybody who has already committed to helping out with the caring and sharing for the holiday season. I know that a lot of names were taken and a lot of people are already working on that, and we certainly appreciate those who are involved in the leadership, and thank you for your participation and the way that you'll give to young people and help them through this holiday season will be a tremendous blessing to all of them, I know, and it also will be a blessing to us. Last week, when we closed the study of Exodus chapter 14, the middle part of it, we said that we concluded with three thoughts, beginning in verse 13, that Moses gave the people as they're preparing to physically leave the land and go through the Red Sea. And those thoughts were, and they're important for our study tonight. We're going to try to finish chapter 14. We'll just highlight some of the thoughts. Most of it you've studied many times in your life. But the three thoughts were, number one, don't be afraid. So he said, do not fear. Number two, he said, watch what the Lord is going to do. So he said, stand and see the salvation of the Lord. And then number three is found in verse 14. He said, the Lord will fight for you. Now, throughout the course of the study of Exodus, from the very beginning, God has been telling his people over and over again that he is going to be glorified in their coming out of Egypt. That's part of the reason that God was going to bring them out of Egypt, so that his name could be glorified. And he tells them over and over again that Pharaoh is going to know his name. Remember, there was a time where Pharaoh said, I don't even know who God is. When Moses mentioned his name, who is this God? I don't know him. And God has been telling his people all along, I'm going to teach Pharaoh who I am. I'm going to teach him a lesson, and he will know who I am, and all of the Egyptians will know who I am, and everybody will know who I am. They will know that I am God. Pharaoh will know that he is not in charge, that I'm in charge. And so throughout the course of the study, this is what God has been saying. And it's almost as if we get to this section of Exodus chapter 14, that this becomes a culmination, if you will, of all that God has been saying that is going to happen, and now we're going to actually see this take place. And so throughout all of the years, it's like 430 years that it's been building up, that God is going to save his people. He keeps telling them that he's going to, that Pharaoh will recognize who he is. Pharaohs have come and gone during the course of this time. And so all through this time, God is saying, I'm going to prove that I'm God. I'm going to show that I am in charge and that I can take care of my people. Now, this is important for us today, not just because it's a lesson in history, not because it's exciting drama, not because it's a great story. Even though all of those things are true, it's important for our lives because we need, every day in our life, we need to be reminded of what God is trying to remind these people of at this point in their history. We need oftentimes to understand that whatever we're dealing with in our life, whatever we're going through, whatever circumstances we are facing, we need to hear these words, don't be afraid, because God is going to take care of us. We need to hear the idea that we can just stand back and watch what God can do when we don't understand what God can do. And then we need to hear that God will fight for us, or God will fight with us. And so with that in mind, there are two or three major thoughts that kind of work their way through the rest of this chapter. And I would have just spend a little bit of time on each one of them tonight. Number one, God is going to get the glory, and he is going to show grace in predicting the future to his people. Now, what God is going to do in these first few verses is he is going to tell them exactly what's going to happen. He's told them some of what's going to happen in the past, but now he's going to tell them exactly what is going to occur. And what we see is that he is glorified even in the prediction of what he says about what is going to happen and in the way that he gracefully cares for his people. So let's look at verse 15. The Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the sons of Israel to go forward." So here they are at this moment. They're on the edge of the sea. They're about to leave the land of Egypt, and God says, don't stand around and feel sorry for yourself, but move forward and watch what I'm going to do. Don't be afraid. Watch what I will do, and know that I'm going to take care of you, that ultimately I'm going to take care of you. And again, it's important for us to recognize that whatever we're facing in life, we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be concerned or afraid of the future, and we can look and see what God has done and what God will do. And so notice verse 16. As for you, now he said, here's what I want you to say to the people. I hope you've told them by now not to be afraid, that I'm going to fight for them. Now you move forward, but as for you, you lift up your staff, and you stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, and the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. Now, we know what's going to happen from this point, but God is going to use Moses as a divine instrument. He is simply to hold up his staff. This is, again, I believe, to emphasize that what is to happen is not some amazing natural coincidence. This is not some kind of confluence of all of the natural, some kind of natural phenomenon that is taking place here. This is a miraculous event. This is God doing what God said he would do. This is God providing a way for his people out of Egypt. This is God saying, I will fulfill what I promised to do. And so he says to Moses, all you've got to do is you stand there and you lift up your staff, and the sea will part and the people will go through on dry ground. I heard about a preacher who was preaching this one time, and a fellow was a heckler in the crowd, and he said, well, preacher, you are ignorant. You don't understand that this wasn't really the Red Sea. These were salt marshes, and the children of Israel waded across in ankle-deep and knee-deep water. That's all there is to it. You're not very smart. And the preacher responded by saying, well, praise God. God did an even greater miracle. And the man began to scratch his head and said, what is that? What did he do? What do you mean by that? And he said, God drowned the entire Egyptian army in ankle-deep and knee-deep water. You know, sometimes we think that we know more than God knows. Sometimes we think that we're smarter than God is, and we can figure out through scientific or natural explanations things that God does in the lives of his people. And so God is showing in both of these ways the action of Moses and his sovereign control over this situation. He is showing that this is not just some coincidence. This is not a natural force. I heard another story about a boy who had gone to Sunday school, and he came home and his mother said, what did you study in Sunday school today? And he said, we learned about the children of Israel coming out of Egypt and crossing the Red Sea. And she said, well, tell me what happened. And he said, well, what happened is that the Egyptian army came up on the Israelites, and right as they were about to swoop down and destroy the Israelites, the Israeli Air Force came sweeping down and took out all of the Egyptians, and the Israeli engineers built pontoon bridges over the Red Sea, and the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea and escaped. And his mother said, son, that's not really how the story goes, is it? What did the teacher say? And he said, I know, Mom, but if I told you what the teacher said, you'd never believe me. Sometimes when we see God acting, we're forced to come to the conclusion that God can do what nobody else can do. And God can do what we can never do. And sometimes when God works in our lives or works in the lives of his people, it is impossible to believe. And so God is showing his sovereign care over his people. So if you read on in verse 17, as for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. So all along God has been saying, Pharaoh is going to know who I am. I'm going to show Pharaoh who is in charge. The people will understand more about me. And verse 18 says, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I am honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots and his horsemen. God can use people who deny him, and people who don't believe in him, and people who are openly critical and ridiculing God. God can use those people to see that he is honored. He can use those people to see that he is glorified. Sometimes we see that even in our world today. We see something happen through some person who doesn't recognize God or who doesn't worship God as being the true one and only God. And we say, well, look at that. How does that happen? Well, here's how it happens. Because God can use individuals that we may not want to use or that we may not think that he can to see that his name is glorified. And what God is trying to do in the course of this particular event is to show Pharaoh who is in charge, and to show the children of Egypt, or to show the Egyptians and the children of Israel that he keeps his promises. So God gets the glory even in the prediction of what is going to happen. Number two, God receives the glory and he shows grace in the way that he protects his people. God has promised his people throughout the history of the Israelite nation, from the time that they are taken into captivity, 430 years until now, when they are leaving Egyptian captivity, God has been telling his people that he is going to take care of them, that he is going to look after them, that he is going to provide for them. And so God does that even in the course of the time that they're in slavery. He does that when they're wandering in the wilderness. God will do that over and over again. And when God shows his protection for his people, remember back in chapter 13, we talked about the 3 P's. We talked about God's providence. We talked about God's promises, and we talked about God's presence. And remember, the presence was that God would be in the pillar of the cloud and the pillar of the fire. And so look now, pick up with me in verse 19. The angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved them from before them and stood behind them. And so this is God's protection. This is God's presence. And so it came between the camp and Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was a cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. God is showing his protection. Isn't it interesting in the language that's used in verse 19? The angel of God, which had been going before the camp. There's a lot there, and we can't cover all of this, but notice how the angel of God is identified with the pillar of cloud. So a couple of things here. The children of Israel know the pillar of cloud, and they know the pillar of fire are not some sort of inanimate, magical objects that are the source of the protection. They are visible representations of God's presence among his people. But they are there to emphasize that they are the visible representation of his presence. The pillar and the fire, the pillar of cloud, are identified as being the angel of God. And sometimes in the Old Testament, and it's more readily seen sometimes than it is at others, when the Bible uses that phrase, the angel of God, or the angel of the Lord, it is not just any angel, but oftentimes it represents the very presence of Jesus Christ, a pre-incarnate form of Christ coming to show God's presence and God's power and God's protection. You can't always tell, but there are moments when you're convinced that Christ is present even with the people in Old Testament days. One that is almost certain is the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when there are 3 men bound and cast in the fire. And when Nebuchadnezzar comes back the next day and he says, I don't see 3 men bound, but I see 4, and they're up walking around, and one is like the Son of God. And so we believe that Jesus from time to time shows up in the Old Testament to show protection and to show presence and to show providence. So the great enemy here, of course, is the Egyptian army and Pharaoh himself. Let me point out something here in verse 20. It's not an easy verse to translate. I went back and looked at a number of different translations and noticed that many of them are different. But the idea is the manifestation of the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. The children of Israel saw the fire, and they had light, whereas the Egyptians saw darkness. Joshua 24 verse 7 recalls the very fact that the Egyptians were kept in darkness. So the idea here in Exodus 14 verse 20 is that there was a cloud that came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. And the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. And so the point is that somehow, again in a miraculous way, the Israelites always were in light. They were always in the light. But the Egyptians were in the dark. And Joshua again in Joshua 24 reminds us of this. He recalls the fact, as he's recalling the history of the people of God, the fact that the Egyptians were kept in darkness. So a couple of things. First of all, God once again makes a distinction between his people and those who were not his people. As we've said over and over again, the book of Exodus is not just a book about those people, but it is about us. It is about the people of God today. It is about God working today. And so Paul, when he wrote to the Corinthians, remember we studied that text there in chapter 10 where Paul says that these were written for our instruction. This is written for us. And he says it's about Jesus, and it's a reminder that God will be with his people always. And so the point here is that God makes a clear distinction between those people who are his and those who are not. And so Peter writes to the church in the first century. And Peter says, you are a peculiar people. You are different. You are an other people. You're people who are not of the worldly sense. But he says, you are a royal priesthood. You are a holy nation. You are chosen to be God's special people. And so in the Old Testament, God had a special people. It happened to be the nation of Israel. It could have been any people that God would have chosen. But God, in large part because of the faith of Abraham, chose these people to be his people. It was a nation of people. And God protected and provided for and providentially looked after this nation. Today, God looks after a people. He has a special people. It is not a nation in the sense that the children of Israel was a nation. It's not a geographical region, but it is a nation of the people of God, made up of people all around the world. If you are a Christian, you are a part of the people of God. You are part of God's family, God's special people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, chosen by God to be his special people. God doesn't look at a special nation today in a geographical kind of way, but he looks at those who have become a part of his family. And God gets the glory for the way that he cares for his people. And that leads me to the third thought, beginning in verse 21, and that is that God receives the glory and he shows grace in the actual leading of his people through the sea. And so let's read it one more time. Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, verse 21. And the Lord sweeps the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land so that the waters were divided. And the sons of Israel went through the midst of the sea on the dry land, and the waters were like a wall to them on the right hand and on their left. I wish we could imagine in our mind what is taking place here. The Red Sea has been parted by God over the course of the evening. And as the children of Israel are going to walk through, the land is now dry ground, and they're going to walk through on dry ground, and they're surrounded by walls of water. I believe it's Adam Clark, in his commentary, who says that the walls on either side were as much as 14 feet high or higher. Think about being completely surrounded by water and walking through that. And God is protecting His people. And He's showing His sovereignty, and He gets the glory for that. And so Moses has stretched out his hand, and we're told in verse 21 that the Lord sends this east wind. Now think about that for a minute. Where are the children of Israel? Well, they're on the west bank of the Red Sea. Where does the wind come from? Well, the wind comes from the east. They have to stand there. How long? Well, read the text. They stand there all night, and they're watching all of this take place. Through the night, they're seeing the sea actually being parted. Look, even in God's protection of His people, He demands exercises of faith. They stand there all night, we're told. The language in verse 21 is the Lord sweeps back the sea by a strong east wind all night and turns the sea into dry land. So God shows His glory, and He gives His grace even through the parting of the sea. None of the children of Israel could have said that they did something in order to earn their deliverance from the people of Egypt. None of them could have said that they did anything to get themselves through the Red Sea. God had put them at a point where the only thing that they could do was to trust Him and to have faith in Him. And sometimes in our lives, we get to points along the course of our life where we realize that we can't do this by ourselves. We can't make this on our own. There's no way humanly that we can do this. But through faith, we trust God. And God says that all things will work together for good for those who love me and for those who are called according to my purpose. And God says, I will never leave you or forsake you. And God says, I will be with you always, even unto the end of the earth. And God says, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, and I will give you rest. Sometimes, the only thing that we can do is trust God and have faith that what God has promised us will come true. And that's exactly what's taking place here. You see, God has told His people over and over again, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to provide for you. But think about this. It took 430 years. 430 years for them to escape Egypt. Could God have gotten them out of there sooner? Well, of course He could. Any moment, God could have made it to where they would have never been taken captive in the first place. And God could have gotten them out at any point along the way. But what they had to learn is that God provides for His people in His time. And they had to learn patience. They had to go through circumstances during the course of that 430 years that they didn't want to go through. And no doubt there were family members who died and people who turned against God and who walked away, and they watched all of that. Now the time has come where they're at a place with the Red Sea before them and the Egyptian army behind them. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do now? What are you going to do when you feel like that you're at a place in your life where you look forward and you see difficulty, and you look behind you and you see problems? And God comes along and God says, don't be afraid. And we think, yeah, right. That's easy for you to say. God says, don't be afraid. Watch and see what I can do. And know that I will work with you. Or I will fight for you. And that brings me to the final point of this particular study. And that is that God gets His glory and He shows His grace by destroying the enemy. Look with me beginning in verse 23. Then the Egyptian took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. And at the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. And He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and He made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel." Now look at this. Don't miss the end of verse 25. "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." You see that? Remember what God had said to Moses just a few verses before this? Back in verse 12 and 13 and 14, "The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent." And so here they are now, with the Egyptians on their trail and the sea before them. And God allows them to walk through on dry ground, and the Egyptians are confused. And all of a sudden they've lost their ability to drive their chariots. And they say, "We got to get out of here." And notice the wording in verse 25. "For the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." You see what they called Him? The Lord. The Lord is fighting for them. These are people who did not recognize the Lord. These were people who didn't believe the Lord. They were led by a man who said, "I don't know who this God is, this Lord you're talking about." They had over and over again denied the Lord. And now they're crying out, the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians. And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it. And the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army. They had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained, but the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on the right and the left. And the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And when Israel saw, listen how he closes, when Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in His servant Moses. So they had at times, in their own journey, they had questioned God themselves. They had wondered, is there any way God can get me out of this? So I want to ask you tonight, have you ever been there? Have you ever been at a place in your life where you felt like that you were surrounded by all kinds of bad things, and so many things had gone wrong in your life? It had happened to you, and you're wondering, how in the world can God fix this? How can God get me out of this? And so because of a lack of faith, you say, "Well, I don't believe God can do this, so I've got to figure out how to do it myself. I've got to get myself out of this situation." And sometimes God says, "Don't be afraid." But we want what we want now. We want God to work when we want Him to work. It was 430 years of slave labor that these people were involved in until they get to this point. But now they see the work of God, and now they say, they trust God and they have faith in what God says. And part of the reason I believe that we're given the account of this event is not so that somebody can make a movie about it, for Charlton Heston to star in. That's not why we're given this. Part of why we're given this is so that we can look back and see. Remember, Paul said to the Corinthians that these are written for your instruction. This is for you. And maybe it will help us. Just maybe it will help us when we look back and we see how God cared for His people and how He protected them and provided for them, and how he crushed the enemy in his time. Not when they wanted it to happen, but in his time. And maybe you feel like you're facing an enemy today that's greater than the Egyptian army or greater than Pharaoh. And you're wondering how in the world. Trust God. Have faith that what God says will come true. Believe that God will take care of you. Believe that God can work out all things for your good. Believe that God will never leave you or forsake you. Believe that God will always stand beside you and he'll get you through. And we too then will say, look at the goodness of God. And we will believe that whatever God says will be true. And so my prayer is that this particular situation in the life of the children of Israel will help us to grow in our faith and will help us to trust God more and believe that what God says will be true. Now in chapter 15, beginning in chapter 15, we're going to see really the beginning of how the people of Israel are going to worship God for the rest of their time as a nation. And we're going to start out in chapter 15 with what has been called the Song of Moses. The Song of Moses. It's a beautiful song. It's a great story about how God has cared for his people. I want to encourage you to read the Song of Moses beginning there in Exodus 15. Be prepared for our discussion about that. But maybe tonight there's someone in this assembly who has never expressed their faith in God, who's never been obedient to him, because you've wondered if God can fix the problems in your life or take care of the sin that's in your life. And if you find yourself in that situation tonight, we encourage you tonight to trust God. We encourage you to stand still and see what God can do. We encourage you to reach out your hand to the hand of God. And if you'll do that through faith and in repentance, give your life to him, if you'll confess his name and be immersed, he will forgive you of your sin, and he will walk with you through whatever trials you face the rest of your life. And if you're a Christian and you've turned your back on God, if you've given up on him, won't you ask him to forgive you, and won't you recommit your life to him and know that he can do what he promises he can do, and that he will do what he promises he will do. If you need to respond, if you have a need that we can help you with, we invite you to come while we stand together and while we sing this song.